In the mid-19th century, when plantations stretched across the American South, and the air was heavy with the cries of those forced into servitude, there lived a man whose greed had no boundary, and whose soul was swallowed by the cruelty of power. He was a plantation owner known across Georgia for his wealth, his arrogance, and his deep disdain for the people who worked his land. His fortune had been built on the backs of enslaved men and women, yet even in his abundance he hungered for control and found no satisfaction in mercy. Among his many possessions was his daughter, a young woman whose life had been shaped by isolation, indulgence, and the harsh judgment of her father. She had grown up shielded from kindness and love, and as the years passed, her body grew large and her heart fragile in a house where appearance meant everything. Her father saw her not as a person, but as a burden and an embarrassment to the legacy he had built. When the time came for her to be married, no suitor came forward, for no man of standing would take the hand of a woman the world mocked for her size or her melancholy. Her father grew bitter and desperate to rid himself of what he saw as shame upon his name, and in a moment of twisted reasoning he made a decision that would stain his land forever. He turned to one of his enslaved men, a strong and obedient worker, who had known nothing but the whip and the weight of endless labor. The owner called him into his quarters and made a vile proposal. He offered the enslaved man his daughter, promising him food, shelter, and the illusion of freedom in exchange for a union that defied every law of decency. The man hesitated, for he knew that to refuse meant punishment. Yet, to accept meant becoming a pawn in a cruel spectacle. The daughter wept when she learned of her father's demand, for she understood that she was being handed over, not as a wife, but as a symbol of her father's dominance over both her and the enslaved man. There was no love, no consent, no dignity, only a command born from pride and humiliation. In the silence of that plantation night, the enslaved man obeyed what he could not resist, and the daughter endured what she could not escape. In those moments, the house that once stood proud with wealth became a prison filled with sorrow and shame. The father believed his authority unchallenged, that by binding his daughter to a slave he had rid himself of disgrace. Yet in his arrogance, he had crafted a nightmare that would consume them all. The daughter's health began to fail her body, bearing the pain of both her father's cruelty and her own despair. She rarely left her room. Her laughter vanished, her eyes hollowed by the weight of betrayal. The enslaved man carried his own torment for every time he saw her. He saw the cost of his survival and the reflection of chains that no promise could break. Rumors began to spread across the nearby plantations, whispers of the master who had given his own daughter to a slave out of spite and madness. Workers in the fields spoke of strange cries from the big house and of nights when no lamps were lit. The father dismissed the talk, claiming he had done what was necessary for order, but in truth he could no longer bear to face his creation. One night, when the daughter's suffering grew unbearable, something inside the enslaved man broke. He had endured lashes, hunger, and humiliation, but he could not bear to watch her fade into silence. He confronted the master, demanding mercy for the woman who had become more victim than daughter or wife. The plantation owner sneered at him, struck him down, and laughed that a man born in bondage dared to speak of compassion. What happened next would haunt the land for generations. For in that final act of pain and fury, the enslaved man did what no one expected. He took the daughter's lifeless body and laid it before her father, as if to show him what his cruelty had wrought. The father collapsed, his arrogance shattering into grief and terror. The house fell quiet. The fields grew still, and those who lived under his rule knew that something sacred had been broken beyond repair. From that day forward, the plantation was said to be cursed, the laughter of the enslaved replaced by whispers of a woman who wandered the halls at night, her steps heavy, her sorrow endless. The story passed from tongue to tongue through the years, a grim reminder of what happens when power devours humanity and love is twisted into control. The daughter became a ghost, not just in spirit but in memory, her life reduced to a lesson carved into the soil of the South. Her father's fortune crumbled, his name forgotten, his land reclaimed. By time and silence, the enslaved man vanished into history. Some say he escaped, others that he was hanged for his defiance. Yet in the hearts of those who heard the tale, He became a symbol of the unbearable cost of survival under tyranny. So the plantation stood empty, its windows dark and its doors creaking with the wind, until finally it collapsed into ruin, leaving behind only fragments of a story too cruel to forget. A father's pride, a daughter's suffering, and a man's despair, bound together in the soil where mercy never grew and freedom was bought with pain. The daughter of the plantation owner had grown up in a house where love was a stranger and judgment a daily visitor. Her father was a man who valued wealth and reputation above the sanctity of human life, and every glance he cast upon his only child was laced with disappointment. She was not the daughter he had wanted, nor the reflection of the power he hoped to show to the world. Her size became a source of humiliation to him, and he saw in her body a reminder of his own failures. As the years passed, she learned to live quietly in the shadows, moving through the great halls of the estate like a ghost. She found solace only in books and fleeting moments of silence away from her father's cruel eyes. But the whispers never stopped. The servants pitied her, the guests mocked her, and the man who should have protected her instead turned her sorrow into his sport. When the plantation began to suffer losses from drought and debt, the father grew restless. His temper worsened, and the daughter bore the brunt of his anger. He believed her presence brought misfortune, and began to speak of her as though she were a curse rather than blood. Desperate to rid himself of her, he devised a plan that defied reason or morality. In his mind, she was a burden, and in his cruelty he decided she would serve as a lesson to those he commanded. He summoned one of his strongest enslaved men, a person who had known the lash and the weight of chains since birth. The man had never spoken, out of turn never resisted his orders, and for that loyalty, he became the pawn of his master's most vile scheme. The master offered the man something that was no offer at all. He commanded that he take the daughter as his own, not out of affection, but as an act of ownership, one meant to degrade both of them. The daughter pleaded for mercy, but her father's heart was stone and his pride would not allow retreat. The enslaved man bowed his head, for he had no power to refuse. The day of their forced union was not one of joy but of despair. The walls of the mansion echoed with the sobs of a woman stripped of dignity and the silence of a man condemned to carry out his master's cruelty. The air grew heavy with sorrow, and even the workers in the fields felt the change in the wind, for they knew that something dark had entered the house. Days turned into weeks, and the daughter began to fade. Her laughter was gone. Her steps slowed, and her eyes, once filled with timid hope, were now hollow. She ate little, spoke rarely, and sat for hours, staring into the horizon as if waiting for a mercy that would never come. The enslaved man watched her suffer and felt a guilt that was not his to bear. For though he had done no wrong, he had been made to share in her punishment. Their lives had been bound together not by love but by cruelty, and in that binding both were destroyed. The father meanwhile continued his life of indulgence, convinced that he had restored order to his world. He walked through his plantation boasting of control, while in truth his home was rotting from within. As her health declined, strange occurrences began to trouble the house. Servants whispered of soft cries in the night, of footsteps echoing through empty halls, of windows that fogged without reason. The father dismissed it all until one night when he entered his daughter's room and found her near death. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale as ivory, and her eyes distant as though already beyond his reach. In that moment, perhaps a spark of humanity flickered within him, but it was too late. The enslaved man stood at her side, his face wet with tears that dared not fall before his master. For once the plantation owner saw the cost of his pride, reflected in the suffering of those he had broken. When she died, the house fell silent. No one dared speak her name for fear of angering the master who now lived as a shadow of the man he once was. The enslaved man carried her body to the garden, where she had once sat in her brief moments of peace, and there beneath a tree he laid her down. The father ordered her buried without ceremony, claiming that her death was the will of God, but the people who lived on that land knew better. They said, the ground trembled that night as if the earth itself mourned for the woman who had never known kindness, and for the man who had been forced into a sin. He did not choose. In the days that followed, the master became restless. He heard her voice in the corridors calling his name not with love but with accusation. The sound drove him to madness. He began to drink heavily and wander the plantation, muttering to himself about debts that could never be repaid. The enslaved man disappeared one night and was never seen again. Some said he fled into the woods, others that he was taken by the same spirit that haunted the house. The crops failed, the animals grew sick, and the workers abandoned the fields one by one, until the plantation stood empty and cursed. Years later, travelers passing through the region would see the ruins of the mansion, its windows shattered, and vines climbing its walls. They spoke of a heavy presence there, of a figure that watched from the upper window, her outline faint but unmistakable. Some claimed to hear the sound of chains and weeping carried on the wind, a reminder of the cruelty that had once ruled those grounds. The story became a warning whispered across the South, a tale of pride, cruelty, and the suffering of the innocent. It told of how power, when wielded without mercy, destroys not only those enslaved, but those who believe themselves masters. The daughter's tragedy became legend, her memory a ghostly echo that refused to fade. She was remembered, not for her father's shame, but for the sorrow she endured and the compassion she inspired in those who heard her tale. Her story stood as proof that even in the darkest corners of history, the voices of the broken would not remain silent forever. After the death of the plantation owner's daughter, the land that had once thrived under the sweat of enslaved labor began to decay, as if nature itself refused to forgive what had been done. The great house stood tall but hollow, its windows dark, its walls soaked with the memories of cruelty and grief. Those who remained on the estate spoke in whispers, afraid to say too much for fear that her spirit lingered, watching, listening, waiting. The father who had once walked with pride now moved, like a ghost through his own home, haunted by what his own hands had created. His power could not shield him from the echo of her cries, nor the weight of his guilt, which grew heavier with each passing night. He drank from dawn to dusk, hoping to drown the voice that called his name from the shadows. Yet the more he tried to forget, the louder it became, until finally he stopped speaking to anyone altogether, shutting himself inside the room where his daughter had breathed her last. The enslaved, people who had once been forced to labor for him, began to flee in silence, slipping into the forests under the cover of darkness. Some said they saw the daughter's spirit walking beside them, guiding them away from the land that had imprisoned them, while others believed the plantation itself had turned against its master. Doors slammed without wind, lamps flickered though untouched, and footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. At night the father could hear her weeping and sometimes laughing, a hollow sound that tore through the silence of the old mansion. The once grand fields became overgrown with weeds, the crops rotted, the cattle died, and the river that ran beside the estate turned murky and slow. The plantation, which had stood as a symbol of the man's wealth and power, had become a monument to his downfall in his loneliness. The father began to speak to the portrait that hung in the hall, a painting of his daughter from her younger years before he had broken her spirit. He begged for forgiveness, but his words met only the sound of rustling leaves and distant thunder. He would call her name through the corridors, and sometimes he thought he saw her reflection in the mirror, staring back, not with love, but with sorrow and judgment. The enslaved man who had once been forced to take part in her suffering had vanished, leaving behind only the memory of his defiance and his grief. Some believed he had escaped to freedom, while others said he had been claimed by the same restless spirit that haunted the plantation. The neighboring estates soon came to know the place as cursed. No one dared visit after sunset. Travelers who passed by claimed to see a flicker of light in the attic window, or hear faint singing, carried by the wind. Some said the song was soft and sorrowful. Others claimed it was a lullaby meant for a child she would never have. For decades the story spread through the region, twisting and changing, yet always carrying the same truth, that cruelty never dies quietly. The plantation owner's name was erased from history, his family line ended, and his estate abandoned to ruin years, turned into decades, and the forest began to reclaim the land. The great columns of the mansion crumbled, vines crept across the walls, and the roof collapsed, letting the rain fall freely into the halls where laughter had once echoed. In time, only the foundation remained, and even that was swallowed by the earth. Yet the story lived on, passed from elder to child, a tale of power, pride, and punishment. It was said that on nights when the moon was full and the air still, one could hear the soft hum of a woman's voice rising from the ruins and the faint clinking of chains carried on the wind. The daughter's spirit became a legend in the region. Some called her the Lady of the Fields, others, the ghost of the river people, claimed she appeared to those who sought mercy, guiding lost souls out of darkness. Her sorrow had turned to compassion, and her haunting to warning. She reminded those who heard her tale that no wealth could erase cruelty, and no power could silence truth. Her father's cruelty had made her a prisoner in life, but in death, she became a symbol of release, her story breaking free from the silence that had once bound her. Over time, historians unearthed fragments of records, letters, and rumors, piecing together the tragedy that had unfolded there. They found evidence of a powerful man whose greed consumed his family, of a daughter forced into shame, and of an enslaved man driven to despair. The details blurred across generations, but the essence remained the same: a tale of domination turned against itself, and a warning written into the soil of the South. The land where she had lived and died became a reminder that every act of cruelty plants a seed of retribution, and that no heart, however powerful, can escape the weight of its own sins. In the end, the plantation owner died alone, surrounded by the ghosts of those he had broken. His body was found near the fireplace, a bottle beside him, and the faint scent of lilies in the air. The servants buried him beside his daughter, though none spoke prayers over his grave. The wind howled through the trees that night, and some said it carried her voice, whispering words he could no longer hear. Long after the house was gone, travelers continued to avoid the path that once led to the plantation. They said the ground was colder there, and the birds never sang. When storms swept across the region, lightning always struck the same spot where the house had stood, as if the heavens themselves remembered. The story of the obese daughter who had been given to a slave and the horror that followed became more than history. It became a legend of reckoning, a tale that crossed generations, teaching that power without mercy consumes itself. And so her name, though lost to time, lived on through the whispers of those who feared the curse and respected the sorrow that lingered. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of humanity, where cruelty seeks to bury compassion, truth endures, rising again like the wind over the broken fields that once bore witness to a father's sin and a daughter's silent pain.